Greetings and thank you for joining our Group B, with myself, Ariel, Marcy, Sarah, Lauren, and Mark, as we discuss 5 different dissertations that focus on the appreciative education and ecological theoretical frameworks. So first, I chose to review a 2016 dissertation by Socorro Arliss Wilson James that focused on the impact of appreciative education on the retention of Latina students in the first year of higher education. So first, to provide you with a brief overview of the abstract of the dissertation that I reviewed, Wilson James was operating on the premise that old retention models were less effective at retaining students of color, specifically Latina students, in higher education. So they decided to use the appreciative education approach for first-year seminar courses. This study aimed to determine whether a relationship existed between appreciative education methods and the retention of Latina students. The teaching approach that was used was based off of this thing called the CREATE model, which built students' capacity for learning, letting them to determine their own values and capabilities, and gave them the freedom to appreciate their own educational journey. So to begin this study, Wilson James first looked at the impact that first-year seminar courses have had over the past 15 years. And according to Clark and Cundiff, first-year seminar courses were originally designed based on the premise that student commitment and success depended on the student's sense of belonging to their institutions. Because of this, studies had mixed results. And so this then led to new teaching methods for first-year courses, which included active learning, discussions, and small group collaboration. And this new method was used as the foundation for the retention study for Latina students. So specifically, the approach that was used was based on appreciative education, which the author called CREATE. And this stands for collaborative, reflect, express, act, technology, and evaluate. And although appreciative education considered retention a university-wide effort and something that should be like the holistic approach and something that every department should have a role in, the quantitative study that was done here focused on the evaluation of the CREATE curriculum's impact and effectiveness of retention rather than the whole university's effect on Latina students within their first year. So what is appreciative education? According to Bloom, Houston, He, and Conkle, appreciative education is the organizational and individual framework for creating culture with high standards that simultaneously embraces ongoing change and improvement. It is theoretically rooted in social constructivism, which means that education is not an affair of telling and being told, but it's an active and constructive process. It's also rooted in positive psychology, which we all should have read for this week, and appreciative inquiry, which we are going to discuss a bit later. Appreciative education also says that knowledge is constructed through collaboration and that it builds on aspects of our prior understandings that we have, which then triggers the positive connections between new concepts and past experiences, which inevitably motivates us to learn new materials. Those with an appreciative mindset view teaching as a learning process for all and find the best in their students. So they're really looking at the student as an active learner and a collaborative piece to this process. So one of the most important aspects that I just mentioned of the appreciative education is this collaboration. It's an extremely inclusive part of the student experience. This idea was at the heart of the study and was framed through the 6D model of appreciative education, which was created by Bloom, Houston, He, and Conkle. This model includes disarm, discover, dream, design, and deliver, and to do not settle. And it empowers students in the course to help create the curriculum that they would be experiencing. So it went from a place where the first year seminar curriculum was already created and laid out for them to really including and incorporating the students' experience and allowing them to create the curriculum for them and the students that came after them. And according to Bloom and Houston, he and Conkle, allowing students to engage in an appreciative education framework provides a flexible framework for innovative practices like positive interaction, such as good communication and collaboration, reciprocal learning, like critical reflection and engaging discussions, holistic engagement, such as connecting experiences with values and life goals, and strategic design, like allowing students to develop future plans and achieve goals, which we saw in the creation of this new curriculum. So as we switch our focus to the results of the study, the change in curriculum unfortunately did not show a significant difference in the one-year retention responses for first-year Latina students. However, the study did reveal that more students with failing grades were retained than expected, and fewer students with passing grades were retained than expected. More females than expected passed the course, and fewer females than expected did not pass the course. The study concluded that the retention of students must be integrated into all efforts on campus and by all members of the campus community, including students themselves. So while this study did primarily focus on the retention, it makes you wonder that with this framework of appreciative education, what were the other significant changes that happened? I wonder about their well-being or the effect that it just had on their learning and engagement inside the classroom, or just their happiness. So again, while we didn't see any significant changes in retention, I'd be curious to see the studies that maybe the impact it had in other areas. And that is it for me. So thank you.
Okay, greetings. Thanks, Ariel. So the dissertation that I chose was by Dr. Sarah A. Clemens Thompson, entitled "The Problem We All Live With, A Critical Appreciative Approach to Undergraduate Racial Justice Activism." And I wanted to let you know one of the reasons I chose this dissertation was this is Dr. Clemens Thompson is actually a graduate of our program. I believe she was part of cohort 12. And before I talk a little bit more about it, I wanted to bring attention to the title. So she starts her dissertation by talking about 6-year-old Ruby Bridges as the first African-American child to integrate her school on November 14th, 1960, where she was escorted into William Frantz Elementary School by 4 U.S. Marshals. And that was after the landmark Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education that ended segregation in the schools in the United States. So in 1964, American artist Norman Rockwell, who worked for Look magazine at the time, created an illustration of Ruby and called it "The Problem We All Live With," which depicted her, first walk into the school. And so in Dr. Clemens Thompson's, she wanted to honor early examples of student racial justice activism in the title of her research. And so before we talk about the theoretical framework, I did want to mention that just kind of a statement of the problem of this dissertation. So recent student activism has prompted changes within colleges and universities, and activism is actually, at some universities, is encouraged for the learning outcomes that they provide students in those institutions. However, there are definitely also situations and instances where it's met with much resistance and even reprimand by administrators. And so when looking at the problem, Dr. Clemens Thompson recognized that there's little research as to how colleges and university administrators engage in proactive strategies to collaborate with student activists who call for multicultural reform on their campuses. And so essentially what she was trying to do through her research was fill in this gap to help, in her words, to help student affairs educators shift potentially negative views of protesters and demonstrators and embrace activism as a necessary developmental element of the undergraduate student experience. So if you want to switch the slide, please. So just really quickly, although the theoretical framework is a little bit different, I did want to draw attention just real briefly to appreciative inquiry. And this is from the Whitney and Trost and Bloom chapter that we read. And from the very, very beginning of that chapter, and looking at the exploration of what gives life to humans, the strengths, successes, values, hopes, and dreams, and grounded in affirmation and appreciation. So just be thinking along those lines as we move into our next slide, which is the theoretical framework for the critical appreciative inquiry. So Dr. Clemens Thompson's research examined undergraduate racial justice activism through a critical appreciative inquiry framework. And so to pull out in her words, from her dissertation, this is how difference, power, and diversity impact positive inquiry in which a highly complex problem has been identified. And CAI positions the privilege, power, and oppression that dominant identities possess when exploring solutions to ensure equity and justice for all those with marginalized identities. And one of the things I thought, one of the statements that I pulled out of her work that I really felt summed up her research and her work, I believe investigating racial justice activism through a critical appreciative inquiry framework honors a shared humanity, affirms a sense of belonging, and creates urgency among a university's administration that places its students of color at the center of reform work. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just an excerpt from the abstract. It was a very long abstract, so just an excerpt. But so I'll just give you a little bit of background in terms of the research and the setting. So the research was done with a small residential private four-year liberal arts institution. And essentially, in her reading, she had read that about this institution where racist events had inspired student activists to lead a student rally and create a list of demands that were presented to the administration. And this institution has approximately 2,500 students with a student faculty ratio of 12:1, where white students make up approximately 75% of the student population. And with African American, Latinx, and Asian students totaling just under 10%. She also indicated that nearly 9% of the students indicated their race is unknown. And when we look at the case study methodology, so essentially, what it was a chronology of events that provided a detailed description of the racist events that happened on the campus that led to a student rally, the creation of a list of demands by student activists, and a response from administrators at the case study institution. So Dr. Clemens Thompson, what she did was she did semi-structured interviews with students, faculty, and staff. She did a document analysis to review the list of demands, the university strategic plan, and some other documents, and then observed online coverage of the rally from multiple different sources. So if you could go ahead and click to the next slide. So on this slide, you can see the research questions as well as her findings or the strategies that she found were incorporated. And so looking at that first research question, what constitutes a critical appreciative approach to undergraduate racial justice activism? Dr. Clemens Thompson found 4 different themes that emerged, or strategies. The first one was the strategy of connection. She found that time spent getting to know first-year students of color on campus by the staff and faculty was important, and that this intentional relationship building was especially helpful in establishing trust. She also found collaboration. So she discussed how African-American student activists sought help from faculty and staff advisors as they created their list of demands and planned the rally. And because they had these strong connections, the faculty and staff helped the students navigate the bureaucracy of campus politics and help them to present their grievances in a constructive manner. She also found the theme of dialogue, or the strategy of dialogue, where staff were able to arrange for student activists to meet with the leadership of the university immediately following the rally. And she also indicated that transparency was part of that. So the administration accepted the demands from the students and continued to update websites and kept that flow of communication open and transparent. So the other research question that is on there: what aspects of institutional culture fostered collaboration with undergraduate student racial justice advocates. And so she found 4 here as well. One of the themes she found was size of the institution, that the small student population size at the case study institution allowed students affairs educators to develop meaningful relationships and build trust with students of color. She found things like early arrival programs or orientations were instrumental in instilling in students a strong support network. Technology was important in terms of communication and instructional planning, where strategic plans were very intentional, made very intentional plans to move towards a more inclusive university, So if you slip to the next slide, you'll see my references here. And if you get an opportunity to look at Dr. Clemens Thompson's dissertation, I would definitely encourage you to do so. So thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Marcy. Building off of that, I'm also going to talk about appreciative inquiry using a dissertation example from Justin W. Miller from The Ohio State University. His dissertation is called The Power of Appreciative Inquiry, Discovering the Latent Potential of an Urban High School. Click. So before we talk a bit about the dissertation, I wanted to provide my take on appreciative inquiry. So from the readings this week, appreciative inquiry is a theoretical framework that approaches organizational change from a positive lens, focusing on possibilities rather than problems. The appreciative side of this framework focuses on the recognition of value, enhancing value, and affirming past and present organizational success. And the inquiry part of this framework focuses on the idea of new possibilities and being open to asking, answering questions, being curious, and focusing on learning and growth. I think one of the main things that I took away after reading about appreciative inquiry was just the really relational aspect of using the framework to approach an organizational topic that is focused on driving some sort of change. Click. So from the Whitney reading this week, this is the 4D cycle is kind of what I think operationalizes appreciative inquiry, so allows members of an organization or leaders or managers to put it into practice. So there are 4 stages here, the 4 Ds, and it is kind of represented in a cycle. So an organization would choose an affirmative topic choice, which would be just a subject of strategic importance to the organization. It could be any number of things, and would begin to use appreciative inquiry through phase 1, which is the discovery phase. This is where members of the organization commit to research that determines within the organization the best of what is and what has been. So this kind of research is looking into best practices. Interviews and focus groups were named specifically as sort of instruments to collect this kind of data. And the whole discovery phase, or phase 1 of the appreciative inquiry cycle, focuses on the identification of the positive core, which is sort of this element of an organization that represents the strengths of the organization, the positive areas where there's room to grow. And so once that positive core is identified from the discovery phase, we move into the dream phase, which is kind of the generative phase that allows members of the organization the freedom to explore hopes and possibilities, or what might be. So this is really kind of a visioning exercise for the specific topic choice. It allows
everyone to kind of start thinking forward into phase 3, which is the design phase. And this is sort of starting to take the knowledge that we have from the discovery phase, and then the sort of hopes and dreams of the dream phase, and starting to kind of put that and solidify that into what the organization sort of should be moving forward. And the whole part of the design phase that's really key to this is something called provocative propositions. So these are sort of vision statements that take sort of everything from the first 2 phases and start to move them forward into kind of a forward future thinking picture of what the organization should be. And then finally, phase 4 is destiny. And this is sort of what I would characterize as like actual operational changes. So, changes to organizational policy, HR guidelines, hiring practices, whatever is sort of the solution-oriented approach to, whatever the topic choice is. And the whole attitude around this is that these changes really do support ongoing learning and improvement. So it's appreciative inquiry as laid out through the 4D cycle is really cyclical, in that, when you're starting to implement changes based on the appreciative inquiry framework, you can sort of see how the tail end of the 4th phase in destiny, being open to learning and new ideas and improvement, could circle right back around into discovery. And so you're kind of looped into this really positive cycle of change, ideally. Click. So a few of my key takeaways about appreciative inquiry. I really like that as a theoretical framework, AI is asset-based rather than deficit-based. As part of my master's coursework, I did a course on school and community relations. And the course was focused primarily on the ways that the kinds of relationships that schools, primarily K through 12 schools, have within their communities, and sort of the way that each benefits the other. And one of the themes or topics that we really focused on as a part of that course was a way of a community development theory called asset-based community development. And appreciative inquiry sort of reminded me of the work that we did around community mapping and asset-based community development, which is really focused on focusing on the strengths of a community, strong relationships with elected individuals, or a strong school board that's involved in the community, those kinds of things, and really working to develop the assets of the community in a really positive way. And appreciative inquiry to me was sort of that same take on let's focus on building up the positive, which is I think just a really positive way to think about undertaking change within an organization or a community. The inquiry mindset of appreciative education, from a personal perspective, I really like that there's this attitude of continuous learning, and the idea of that, it's okay not to know. I think a lot of times, especially in higher education, and I'm sure we've all encountered this in our professional lives working in higher education, that sometimes there's an attitude of, we've always done it this way, and it doesn't seem that there's a huge appetite to want to learn anything other than how we've done things in the past. And appreciative inquiry seems like kind of a way to break out of that attitude and sort of prompt some continuous learning that leads to organizational improvement. I like that AI takes the focus away from the hierarchy. A lot of the aspects of the first two phases, discovery and dream, are they really don't have any type of approach that would I guess that reflects any kind of a hierarchy. The only way that appreciative inquiry would really work as the authors imagined it would is that if everyone within the organization or who's involved in the process has the ability to share and reflect and discover and dream. And I like that there isn't a super, it would be really hard to implement kind of like a top-down decision-making approach to change, to organizational change using a framework like appreciative inquiry. And then finally, I think I just like the spin, a kind of a positive take on organizational change, especially for new leaders. And I think about this a lot with new university presidents, especially those who come from outside of the institution into a new leadership position where, you know, they're walking into presumably an institution that faces its own unique challenges. And a lot of university presidents, you know, do like a listening tour where they travel and they listen to stakeholders talk about the kind of challenges they're facing in their work, and you know how those are reflected in the strategic priorities of the institution or the path to moving forward. And I think as a new leader, and especially as an outsider, you walk in with a certain amount of skepticism, and the last thing that you want to do is start to try and implement any kind of organizational change that really points out the deficits of the institution. And I think that appreciative inquiry would be an interesting way for a university president to highlight the strengths of the institution while still using those to affect positive change. And so I see how, you know, when you're a new leader walking into a delicate situation or a culture that may kind of view you as a bit of an outsider, that this framework in particular would be interesting to use. So now on to the dissertation. Click. So in this dissertation, the author looked specifically into the experiences of participants going through the process of appreciative inquiry as part of, they're all part of this school community. So this is a high school, an urban high school. And this dissertation really focused on the first two phases of appreciative inquiry. So discover and dream. So the participants are sort of developing that compelling vision for teaching and learning within the high school, kind of identifying that positive core that is a result of the discovery portion of appreciative inquiry. Participants in this study were a handful of students and teachers, as well as one school administrator and one school counselor. And the dissertation focused, like I said, on the first two phases of appreciative inquiry. Click. So data for this study was collected primarily through interviews and focus groups. This is that kind of lent itself well to how the first two phases of AI are carried out. So as participants interviewed each other and participated in discussions and focus groups related to the specific activities in phase 1 and phase 2 of AI, that data was collected, as well as field notes resulting from the author's role as a participant observer within the study. So I know we've looked at other dissertations and research examples of a researcher who is embedded in the study, and this dissertation in particular was one of those cases as well. So findings from the dissertation, there were two salient findings that the author primarily focused on. The first is a high level of bridging social capital between teachers and students. So this was described as sort of the way that teachers and students related to each other, and how that relationship opened up opportunities for better collaboration and coordination and relating to each other. And so this was specifically a part of that positive core, a unique strength of this high school in particular. And then the second finding from the study was that most of the high school students exhibited high levels of resiliency and were able to persevere through challenges and develop coping mechanisms and skills that allowed them to overcome those challenges and focus specifically on academic pursuits. This was especially relevant because this was an urban high school, so it presented some unique challenges for students coming from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, minority students who experienced unique challenges as a result of their home life or background. So these two areas were both identified as major strengths as through kind of the lens of appreciative inquiry. Click. So some key takeaways overall, I think paying special attention in this dissertation to the way that appreciative inquiry was used in this study. I think to provide some context, the author discussed at length how school reform in general, specifically talking about K through 12, is typically a deficit-based approach, especially with legislation like No Child Left Behind, as well as even at the state level, the school report cards that come out each year. I know in the state of Ohio, it's kind of a big thing, and there are, certain schools that are targeted for improvement because they fall underneath certain thresholds. And the whole culture of school reform and school improvement to try and get to these standards that are set by state governments or the federal government is focused on fixing a problem to achieve standards. And so it's really sort of the opposite of appreciative inquiry if we're talking about, an asset-based or deficit-based approach to affecting change within an organization. And I think this approach is probably even more true for urban schools that have unique challenges as well. I know this high school was located in the state of Ohio, where property taxes fund K through 12 education. And so, a lot of urban areas sort of struggle with this because, the property taxes that that schools receive as funding aren't necessarily as high as suburban school districts that are located in communities that have, families that come from wealthier backgrounds and benefit from high property taxes and high home values. So because of those unique challenges, it always seems like there's kind of a deficit-based approach to school reform. And the author's point in kind of talking about this and using appreciative inquiry is that it could be a useful tool in managing change and driving school improvement that's more focused on the strength of the individual school building or school district. So we know that there are standards across the board, across the state, that schools have to meet or should be meeting in regards to, high school GPA or standardized test pass scores, graduation rates, and that's fine. But the differences among school districts, or even within school districts, the differences among school buildings can vary greatly based on culture, based on location, based on the families that live in the area. There's so many different factors, and because appreciative inquiry is so focused on the people and the relational aspect of organizational change, that it could be a beneficial tool in helping school leaders like principals and superintendents really key in on those strengths and focus on those to drive school improvement. And I think finally, because appreciative inquiry is so focused on the relations between people or among people within an organization, I think it's especially relevant when we're talking about organizational change within schools or institutions of higher education for that matter, because the core work of that organization is so dependent upon the relational nature of teaching and learning and the relationship between students and teachers. So I think this author provided some really compelling reasoning for why appreciative inquiry was particularly relevant for this context, and definitely helped me see how applying a framework like this could sort of play out in this type of study. That's it.
All right. So Sarah's explanation of her dissertation actually leads really nicely into the one that I found. This was really interesting because it took the lens of appreciative inquiry and really transitioned that from how it could be a benefit in situations in terms of education, but really took a look by Nancy Howell here at how this could help someone's entire life. So not just the work setting, but both the work setting in terms of helping students, but also general job satisfaction, and then overall life relationships and enjoyment. So if you'll go ahead and click, please. The real research question, as I kind of hinted at here, is can using appreciative inquiry as a framework improve job and possibly even life satisfaction? So this particular study really focused on interviews with advisors at four-year institutions. There were 9 advisors overall that were interviewed, and really looked at not just their relationship with their students, but their relationships outside of the work setting. And so how did it help at home? How did it help with other friendships? How did it help just in their overall sense of happiness? And I think it's interesting to note that this study was done in 2010 because the author frequently referred to the fact that appreciative advising is not commonly done. But I think if we were to look today, even if it wasn't called appreciative advising, I think we would see a lot more focus on kind of the intentionality of looking at the positive situation, and that the influence of positive psychology would be a little bit more well known in today's advising interactions. Nevertheless, Howell did claim that because it was such a small sample population, since this method of advising at the time in 2010 was not common, that the results were not generalizable. And her main mission in doing this was really, as she put it at the beginning of her dissertation, just to add to the knowledge base about appreciative advising. So she was not trying to prove something for all time or have a study that could be, scaled and duplicated, but just to really have the reader be able to get into the mind of these advisors and see what appreciative advising did for them. And again, appreciative advising is kind of taking that whole method that Sarah really nicely detailed about appreciative inquiry and then putting that into an advising interaction with a student. So looking at it, not from that deficit perspective, but looking at the positive possibilities with each student issue and really thinking about the long-term goals for the student. Click, please. So a little bit of appreciative advising in context. The lit review from Howell here, she referenced 2 institutions that used appreciative advising in really unique ways that I think are worth looking at. So one was the University of North Carolina in Greensboro, and they particularly piloted appreciative advising with students that found themselves on probation for the very first time. And what they were able to see is that when appreciative advising was used with fidelity in interactions with these students from advisors, there was an 18% increase in retention of the students that had been put on probation for the first time. And they saw a statistically significant, so you all remember stats, statistically significant improvement in the GPA for these students. And so they thought that that was proof positive that this was a concept that would work and that then could be scaled. So the author referenced this as a good example of why appreciative advising would be helpful for other students. And again, her argument was taking it further that what is good for students may also be good for the workers at an institution, and that is equally important. And I think that's a really unique perspective that we don't often hear about, because I think in both student affairs and in academic affairs, we are frequently so focused on how we help our students that sometimes we forget to help ourselves. One of the things that this University of North Carolina study found was that the students who participated had an improved sense of empowerment and control over their own situation. And so again, the author's argument was, if this is good for students, wouldn't it also be good then for advisors? A separate example of appreciative advising in context is Eastern Illinois University, where the adult learners had a greater program persistence and degree completion when they were in a pilot program. And I think this is interesting that they had this with adult learners as opposed to younger students. And so we saw 2 unique examples of when this worked out for students. If you'd go ahead and click to the next slide, please. So the research design for Howell's study was that she did interviews on site with 9 advisors, and she took some time and care to talk through her own advising background and her own bias, in that she does, herself believe in appreciative advising as a practice. And so she took care to really ask some open-ended questions and also give the advisors some case studies to review. She also took very special care to make sure that there was an exactly replicable model of how she did and conducted the interviews. So even though she was on site at 4 different institutions with these 9 advisors, she took care to make sure that she was following the same protocol. Then she transcripted and coded her interview results and really found kind of 4 key categories for how appreciative advising impacted the advisors' lives. So certainly with coworkers, with friends, with families, and then with other relationships that these advisors had. And the beauty of the interview process and the open-endedness of the questions is that you, as the reader, were able to really get a sense of what was inside the advisors' minds as they were working through this modality of advising. And if you'll go ahead and click, please. One of the key findings and takeaways here that I think is really interesting is that every single participant believed that the implementation of appreciative advising caused changes in relationships outside of just the advisor-student relationship. 8 out of the 9 found that it was helpful in advising. There was 1 who was kind of a disbeliever in appreciative advising for changing students' lives, but everyone agreed that appreciative advising and being aware of that process and kind of focusing on the positive and, as Sarah was talking about, the destiny of someone's future or the future situation, and trying to find the way through that was a good thing, at least in their own lives, if not for the larger student situation at the institutions. I think it's worth noting here too that among the 9 advisors, they came from different backgrounds. So there was a nice split between who was brand new to advising, who had been in advising for some time, and also who had been using the appreciative advising model for quite a while, and then who was kind of rather new to it. So ultimately, this study, while it's not necessarily something that can be generalizable to any situation or any setting, did really give a lot of information about the overall student experience. Certainly that appreciative advising is helpful for them, but importantly, that it can lead to much better job satisfaction among the people who use it, and that by itself led to a lot of questions for how higher education could really reorganize itself to more fully appreciate the whole notion of appreciative inquiry and implement that in other settings where maybe we would see less turnover from employees and just a greater sense that the difficult problems we're looking at may have positive solutions that could work for everyone. So lots of interesting things from this. If you'll click to the last slide, there's the reference for Howell's own dissertation from this, which was available on Digital Commons as well. And if you have any questions about it, let me know. Thanks.
All right, so lastly, the dissertation I looked at was the quality and quantity of co-curricular involvement as predictors of college student thriving. It was a dissertation by Matthew K. Vetter in 2019. So if you go to the next slide. The dissertation focused on the thriving framework, and I know other groups will go into more detail on what that, what the readings were and more into thriving, but essentially Lori Schreiner describes thriving as fully engaging and intellectually, socially, and emotionally in the college experience. And what I liked about the dissertation I'm going to get into is it acknowledges that despite the recent decades of research on student involvement, few studies have looked at those experiences from a holistic student success lens. So thriving looks at expanding on positive psychology measures and flourishing, but also ties in those academic challenges and successes that are unique to college students. The flourishing aspect was driven by Seligman and has 5 factors that are positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. And you'll see those outlined in the next slide in the 5 factors of the thriving framework. So thriving's framework also has 5 factors. Those are outlined here. Engaged learning is described as a positive energy invested in one's own learning, evidenced by meaningful processing, attention to what is happening in the moment, and involvement in learning activities. Academic determination is accomplishment that includes emphasis on goal setting, ability to regulate one's own learning processes, and an investment of effort and time and resource management. The positive perspective represents the ways in which thriving students view life, which is expecting good things to happen and reframe negative events into learning experiences. Social connectedness includes having good friends, being in relationship with others. And what I liked about this was in relationship with others who listen to them, not just having relationships, and feeling connected to others so that one is not lonely. And then diverse citizenship is a desire to make a contribution to one's community and the confidence to do so. They take time to help others, responding to them with openness and curiosity. Much of those factors are very closely related to Seligman's PERMA aspects of flourishing, but maybe with a more student-focused lens. In recent years, this framework has been positioned as a psychological framework for students' experience in college and how they pursue pathways for persistence and success. There's also the evidence in reviewing this suggests or shows that there's not one pathway specific for colleges or for college students to thrive. And there's many different pathways that vary depending on the student's ethnicity. And it points out at various points of the dissertation and the review of students of different ethnicities experience the experiences much differently than majority populations, which is a really important aspect as this whole framework comes about. If you go to the next slide. So the dissertation that I selected analyzes the quantity and quality of the involvement. It draws on Aston's theory of involvement that defines quantity and involvement as a quantity and quality of the physical and psychological energy that students invest in the college experience. The purpose of this dissertation was really to gauge the quantity and quality of the co-curricular involvement and the impact that that has on students thriving. So the research question is, to what extent do quantity of involvement and quality involvement in co-curricular activities contribute to a structural model of college student thriving after controlling for campus experiences? If you go to the next slide. So the study itself drew on data from a national study in 2017 on thriving in college. It consisted of 2,973 undergraduate participants at 13 colleges and universities. Most of those participants were female, white, and reported living on campus. And the small private institutions were overrepresented in the study. And I think, as I mentioned before, the important part of this dissertation is really honing in on the idea that most of previous research has looked at the quantity of involvement for students and how that relates to success for, in terms of GPA or retention, but it really doesn't isolate the specific experiences, the specific involvement to be actually causal or certainly correlational. So if you go to the next slide, the findings related to this dissertation really pointed out that the psychological sense of community turned out to be the single strongest predictor of thriving. There's no direct relationship between the quantity of involvement and thriving, and that the quality of involvement was found to be directly predicting thriving. So really this just boils down to that a person's quality of involvement and experience is more important than the quantity. And in student affairs, there's been a long history of always touting and talking about the number of opportunities and the various experiences that students have to get involved. And we're always encouraging them to get involved in more and more. But when it comes into a student thriving or flourishing or their well-being, what's more important turns out to be the quality of their experience and their involvement in those one or two things perhaps that they choose to get really engaged with. And it confirms the indirect relationship between quantity of involvement and the holistic student success. On the last page. So lastly, a couple of other findings and notes in this dissertation were that the growing body of research that over-involvement is actually a challenge for college campuses. Again, student affairs professionals and campuses just pushing the number of opportunities, that students have to get engaged or create their own opportunities, and that really colleges should be focusing their energy and resources to those areas that are most likely to produce quality curricular experiences. Different ways that students can actually get engaged and interact and take on meaningful experiences is what is most likely to contribute to students thriving. And the next slide will be the resources. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us as we shared our theoretical frameworks for the ecological and appreciative education frameworks. We hope that you have a great rest of your week.